Welcome. We go live to Cuba to hear from Foreign Minister Bruno Rodríguez Parrilla on his report on the U.S. blockade of the island. Let's listen.
In the website of MINREX, languages of English and French, ministers are here on the room representing the 12 media outlets of 14 countries that are accredited in Cuba. Minister, you've got the floor. Thank you very much. I thank all your attendance. The upcoming 29 and 30, the UNGA will consider and will adopt the draft resolution entitled "The Need to Lift the Commercial and Financial Blockade Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba." I will provide some data that are detailed in the briefing that are in your power and are at the reach of our people at the MIREP's website and surely in other websites. The aftermaths of the blockade against our country are evidenced clearly in our country as ever before in the shortages that the population faces in lots of daily life areas, including the electricity outages, the food, the difficulties for acquiring medicines, the situation in fuels, the difficulties in transportation, the inflation, as well as the decline of other basic services. The blockade in its conjunction and its intimidating effects in our relationships with third-party countries are fundamental and essential elements of these hurdles. Of course, not all difficulties that determine the complex economic situation today is due to blockade. There are present the structural problems of the economy, difficulties in our economic management, but it is absolutely certain that the way is the tightening, the extreme tightening of the U.S. blockade since 2019. Today, I'm going to show you. On March 1st, 2023 till February 2024, the blockade caused material damages at about $5.6 billion. That is to say, over $5 billion, which means an increase of $200 million regarding the previous period, with a real impact on our economy. This means an impact of $421 million per month. Every 30 days are collected damages of over $400 million. So you can imagine its aftermath. Daily, it has a cost of $14 million. Every 24 hours, it implies $14 million, over $500,000 per hour. At common prices, at current prices, the damages collected rise up to the hundreds of $164 million compared to this figure with the GDP, Cuban GDP, or with our imports and exports, or with the amount of direct investments in Cuba. But if we count up that impact to the value of the international market and the decline of the dollar, the damages accumulated in these 6 decades reached the figure of $1.4 billion. A million of millions of dollars plus $460. So it is practically a million and a half of millions of dollars. So if the blockade didn't exist, the GDP of Cuba in 2023, and recently it was published the figures and the hurdles in the last session of our National Assembly, the Cuban GDP without the impact of the blockade would have ramped up by 8%. These figures are clear and showcase how our economic path could be different without these extraordinary impacts. But these figures are general. I am going to provide you more specific examples of the impacts. The required financing to cover the basic needs of medicines that our people needs. That is to say, the sponsorship that it is required to secure the medicines for our people in a year. It is approximately $339 million. With $339 million, there wouldn't be any shortages of medicines in Cuba. There wouldn't be any difficulties to assist chronic diseases, even serious like cancer, or the heart or brain diseases. There wouldn't be any hurdles to secure antibiotics for intensive care therapies. But those figures are equivalent to 25 days of blockade. If the U.S. government, for humanitarian reasons, would halt the blockade for 25 days, there wouldn't be any shortages of medicines in Cuba. 9 days of blockade, barely a week and 2 days, are equivalent to the necessary money to import the medical equipment, that is to say, cotton, radioactives, needles, sutures, in general, all medical equipment spendable. So it costs $120 million annually, which is equivalent to 9 days of blockade. The insulin for people suffering from diabetes, which is crucial, necessary, because insulin is lives of people depend on insulin. So an hour of blockade are equivalent to the necessary resources to secure all people suffering from diabetes for a year. $12 million approximately. In less than a day of blockade, 18 days of blockade are equivalent to the annual cost of the maintenance, without including the fuels or modernization, but only the maintenance that would secure the functioning of the power grid nationwide. That is $250 million, which the country is deprived of, and it is the direct cause of outages and the shortages of fuel for the productive sector for the public transformation. So the blockade in 18 days triggers damages of that cost. If the blockade halted in a less than 2 weeks, we will grant the maintenance of all thermoelectric plants. The basic food that reaches the basic food services provided to each house in Cuba, and it is true that it is not enough, and it is true that we wouldn't be able to comply with all the distribution of all this of that basic food basket, but the cost of the basic food basket for a year, it is approximately $1.6 billion. So that is equivalent to 4 months of blockade. So if the blockade would lift a few months, the basic food basket would be secured. 38 hours of blockade are equivalent to the cost of producing or acquiring the starting basic materials for a year. That is book tests and other school materials. So that it implies around $20 million, which are equivalent to 38 hours of blockade. The little ones need toys, need didactic toys. Children are innocent. All kindergartens nationwide would have the didactic toys necessary for their development if we have $4.5 million. So it is very cruel and criminal. Half an hour of blockade, less than this encounter will endure. So they are equivalent to the cost of the electric wheelchairs to assist the needs of all the system of teaching for children, teenagers, and youngsters with disabilities. So that is a little more than $500,000, and it is half an hour of blockade. So to guarantee computers in all educational facilities, all Cuban educational facilities, it is needed $25 million, at least $25 million to repair, to modernize computers, which is a virtue of the Cuban education, harmed by the implications, by the aftermaths of the tightening of the U.S. blockade. We could repair them, modernize them for all schools, for all children, girls and boys, teenagers, with only $25 million, which represents 2 days of blockade. But if the blockade would stop 15 minutes, practically the time I have been here talking before you, we could acquire the electronic devices to cover up the need of of auditioned devices for the children and teenagers with hearing problems, who are assisted in their special education in the schools of our country. Just 15 minutes, $144 million dollars. So the blockade affects the development of these special children and teenagers. 7 months of blockade would allow, if it stopped, to acquire all necessary buses to guarantee the public transportation, which causes anxiety and suffering to our people. Around $2.9 billion would be enough. 7 months of blockade. The maintenance for the whole year, the annual maintenance for all the public transportation funds, takes about $40 million. That is 72 hours of blockade, 3 days of blockade. For the construction of an emergency program of a needed program of housing in the country, there would be needed $4 billion, around $4 billion, $3.9 billion, which is equivalent to 9 months of blockade. So that is what they do. What it makes totally different and unique our economy. What makes it different from the impacts of the whole world: inflation, the decline of salaries, very high prices, services that are in a precarious situation, hurdles, difficulties of every kind that are in the global south, in developed countries, and in the poor sectors in the United States, in Europe, or in all these factors are pressing the Cuban economy. In all places are being debated. People are debating about economic results, efficacy of the management of government. But what it makes specific and unique the debate about this issue is the oppressive measure, smothering measure of the blockade over the Cuban economy. I commented to an ambassador of a European country. I said to him, I don't know what would be your economy like if out of the blue your country would be subjected to the conditions Cubans have to face. What would happen with your social policies? What would happen with your levels of social inclusion? The economic war, because it is an economic war waged against our country, not in rhetorical terms, but it is a war in technical terms identified, which is executed against Cuba, causes a situation of a truthful economic war in our country. From the half of 2019, it started the adoption of implementing over 200 sanctions imposed by the government of former President Donald Trump, designed for causing suffering, damaging the Cuban families to trigger social chaos with the excuse of the so-called hearing attacks, and which were just countered, and which were counterattack those dummy hypotheses, and they then call it unexplainable incidents of health. The US government and others are just recognized a few days ago that those attacks didn't exist, that there weren't any attacks or unexplainable health incidents, but a collection of health problems. Some people talked about environmental effects, which has been replicated in other countries, in Washington, the White House. But however, that was the excuse of the implementation of 243 sanctions against the Cuban people, and that was disregarded. But why this measure? Why didn't they lift all those sanctions? President Joe Biden could do it tomorrow if he wanted. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. government lifted sanctions against other countries. It was correct. It was right. We celebrated. Practically the only regime of sanctions that the U.S. government didn't change was the U.S. blockade against Cuba. On the contrary, it tightened even more the blockade during the peak of the pandemic. It hindered the acquisition of lungs ventilators. It was crystal clear that we couldn't import any ventilator coming from U.S. companies at the time of a huge crisis, of a huge health crisis like the coronavirus. It was crystal clear that to import a gallon of oxygen, we needed specific licenses. It was demonstrated, and it was also demonstrated that the U.S. government carried out actions to obstruct oxygen imports of Cuba in that tragic moment of two Latin American countries. If someone has doubts about that, hesitated about the genocidal character of the blockade, which is described and in the specific articles of the Convention against the Convention of the Crime Against Genocide, you just have to notice these are brutal acts. So for you must be known that this is a policy that was described in Otreju's memorandum of April 12, 1960. The majority of you shouldn't have seen photos of that, of Mallory having relations with interfering U.S. troops. It is the Mallory, author of that outrageous memorandum, which says the majority of Cubans support Castro. There you see the document There you see they took 30 years to declassify it. The majority of Cubans support Castro. There's no an effective opposition effective. The only means available to counter the internal support is through the disappointment, unrest, based on the economic dissatisfaction and difficulties. Mallory wrote, if the previous is accepted or we cannot counteract with success the will of the Cuban people, it is urged that we must adopt all means possible to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If it is adopted that policy, it must be the result of a positive decision that demands a plan of action which must be discreet and so to move forward and deny money and supplies to Cuba, so to decline, to shrinken the salaries, to cause hunger and despair and the overthrow of the government. So the U.S. blockade's impact is visible on the streets, on the cities, on the countryside of nationwide. So what is surprising is that this small island with few natural resources, but it has one of the largest reserves of nickel and copper and cobalt, and being a developing country, an emerging economy, the country is being able to develop its economy and build up a social work, a social work recognized by the planet, and in these 60 years it could diffuse the crisis, it could overcome the crisis amid the pandemic in front of the economic world tightened and aggravated by the US government, in which as the most paramount economy in our region. US spokespersons have recognized the broadening of the sanctions against Cuba, a broadening regime of sanctions against Cuba. The system of sanctions is really has a great scope, a prolonged scope in history, which is being applied to any country, and particularly the U.S. Superpower has been imposing on a small island. So the decisions for the U.S. society has been struggling against the U.S. blockade, as is the case of farmers to get licenses for the particular sale of food to Cuba. Someone could say the food sale means that the U.S. blockade has been softened, or it doesn't exist. They will lie. Since 2000, there have been these sections, and these sections has been taking into account humanitarian decisions as of the effect of devastating hurricanes, but no one can think that this is the food trade, because if someone thinks about this, is not duly informed. There are rules of commerce and of goods and rules of sailing. So this by private companies are trading with Cuba exceptionally under these sections, but the financial institutions or private, it alleges common rules in which it is be possible to move products and services in both directions. It is supposed that the international navigation be normal. The sales of food to Cuba are discriminatory and selective. They compel us to pay in advance. They compel us to pay completely in each penny before the loads, before receiving the products. Credits are forbidden for those companies exporting with us, interested in supplying us. It is forbidden to transport those foods in other ship. It is compelling to bring the map to Cuba in U.S. ships, which for these discriminatory features they return to the U.S. Without. So these supplies require licenses. They require authorization from the U.S. government. So that we cannot consider that the United States be a commercial partner, which is not, and we cannot believe that the dissemination that the United States say that these amounts of food are big. If the U.S. government to assist to take into account the interests of the U.S. entrepreneurs would flexibilize these sales, the Cuban purchases could be greater for the economic leverages they provide, the prices and the costs of ships as we are very near. But this has not happened despite the claims of producers and merchants of agricultural produce from the United States. The briefing demonstrates the humanitarian damage to the Cuban families. Someone could say it can be a mistake of management in economies, but what is the result of a design? What is the plan for destroying our constitutional order, for meddling in our internal affairs, to cause damage and suffering to the people? It's the blockade, it's the U.S. blockade against Cuba. In this briefing that you could have access for the first time, we provide some data of how the blockade damages the freelancer sectors of the Cuban economy. There are lethal effects to our international finances, to our economy, that cause direct humanitarian damages. That is the case of the presence of the outrageous presence, the inclusion in the states sponsoring terrorism list. Cuba must never have entered the list, which is Cuba is a victim of the U.S. government, victim of violent actions that are organized, financed from the U.S. territory so far with total impunity, with those incitements to violence and terrorism against Cuba. 9 days earlier, the taking office of the U.S. Current president, Cuba was included in the states sponsoring terrorism list. However, a couple of weeks ago, in May 2024, the U.S. government decided to exclude Cuba from another list, which almost no one knows because it has a secondary a value which has to do with military supplies of the U.S., etc. So the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, in an auditing in the U.S. Congress, when he was asked about disrespectfully parliamentarians for the reasons why Cuba was excluded, was said apart from those countries not cooperating, these people have to explain that Cuba cooperates for the United States, very useful in the application of law, in the compliance of law in the fight against terrorism, against drug trafficking, human trafficking, and organized crime. But that was not most significant. Most significant was that the parliamentarians that they decided to get Cuba out of that secondary list because the context, the circumstances has changed. And then later he detailed that the excuses they used before, they no longer existed. And I added, these excuses, these facts never existed. However, he recognized it, and so that's a contradiction, a flagrant contradiction. And if those pretexts don't exist, and if it is allegedly circumstances changes, but I reiterate that these are no longer these didn't exist. Why did they keep Cuba in the list, in the states sponsoring terrorism list? What does have so why didn't the U.S. Secretary of State and the U.S. government didn't get out of Cuba from that list? The only thing they have to do is to sign a sheet of paper. They could do it this afternoon. They have all the authority, the executive authority to do it. They already did it once. They could do it. They could appeal to decency, to honesty, essential honesty, and do it over again. Between January 2021 and February 2024, as an aftermath of the presence of Cuba in this treasures list, there was reported 1,064 actions of denying services by offshore banks to Cuban or in Cuban banks and in entities, including transfers for purchasing food. We have food on port, wheat, rice, or fuel, with a lot of effort allocated the payments in in international banks, in offshore banks, and those offshore banks cannot execute the money for the measures that imply that Cuba is on that outrageous list. So they deny to download the resources if those transfers don't get to their hands. So that has an effect on the medicines, on fuels, on the repairing pieces for the power grid, and on the it generates crises for our population. Those denying actions of services include those are actions against citizens of our own in third-party countries which are deprived of those services. As a result of the outrageous list, a traveler that visits Cuba, who had traveled to Cuba from 2021, it is not eligible. It is forbidden to access an electronic system for the ESTA visas, the ESTA visa, the ESTA visa, in which 43 countries are privileged. This visa, you can from your mobile, from your cell phone, you can apply for it, go to the airport, and go on a U.S. airline or an international airline with that document in your cell phone automatically. Well, nonetheless, the presence of Cuba in that list and a decision of the U.S. government in January 2021 deprives any traveler, whatever citizen who comes here for any reason, that traveler is being forbidden to get access to the visa. So they are compelled to have a consulate appointment or be related to the U.S. consulate, and it lasts months to get it, and it is very expensive. And so these 43 countries are not the global south, or this raging privilege of visas exists for Western Europe, for members of the European Union, for countries of NATO, for industrialized countries. Obviously, it is applicable for countries issuers of tourism towards Cuba. So it has the objective, the target of affecting the international tourism to Cuba, knowing that the tourism industry has been, over the 35 years, has been the drive for the Cuban economy. It was one of the factors that let us move forward in the amid crisis. So it is directed to hinder the recovery of tourism in Cuba, which has already beaten by the increase of conflicts and wars in the world and inflation, etc. But in recent weeks, the U.S. government published the deprival of these visas to 300,000 European citizens. The U.S. government published the document for undermining, for intimidating the countries, which is a violation of the rights of traveling, which is not only for Cubans but to these people who Cubans cannot travel for religious or student or sports, cannot travel without a specific license or any, or be submitted to repressions because of violating these U.S. regulations. I remember a couple, a cycling couple, that received penal and administrative measures and had to pay the thousands of dollars because of visiting Cuba. So they published those 300,000 names, and so they violate the right to travel freely of the U.S. citizens, of the European citizens, of the 43 countries that are privileged by the ESTA visa. These measures have caused damage to tourism of $2.5 billion, less for the Cuban economy. But the U.S. blockade has a particular impact on the private sector of the Cuban economy, associated fundamentally to tourism, or even to the U.S. Travels. Half of the U.S. citizens that require services in Cuba, it is in the private sector of the economy, which also suffers significantly damages. Likewise, the impact of $5 billion that represented in the last year the impact of the U.S. blockade, or the impact to current prices, or of the accumulated impact of $164 billion, or even the impact of the accumulated damages estimated to the value of gold and depreciation of decline of dollar, that reached $1 million and a half of million of dollars are just added, including the non-policy sector, which the U.S. government says wants to support. The U.S. government lies when they say they want to help the Cuban people. If they wanted to help the Cuban people, they would have to lift the blockade, or even or at least flexibilize the U.S. blockade in the most hit aspects. If the blockade wouldn't exist, the GDP of Cuba, which have declined in these years, but by 2023 the GDP would have ramped up by 8%. But the private sector of the economy, just related to the U.S. citizens' travels, would have received $107 million if the prohibition to travel to Cuba would be lifted or would be changed as it occurred in 2015-2016. Since 2019, in that summer, the United States hit seriously 53 ships, suppliers of oil and other 27 companies. As a result of the blockade, there are constant disruptions of the electric service, which generating emotional and damages, anxiety, suffering that endangers and leads to running out of order of equipments, the shortages of water to dwellings, which impacts on the productive sectors, on public transportation, and in general in the whole economy. The announcement of the US government in May 2024 about some changes within the framework of regulations for the private sector in Cuba, it is just not applicable. It does not comply till this minute, and the deadline for the US government that must answer the questions of entrepreneurs, of freelancers, and the US bank workers. Well, they do not comply because these measures are not complied because the US blockade hinders them. They have to be crazy if they associate with Cuban companies or any Cuban institution with these sanctions. So, in second place, they want to destroy the constitutional order. Thirdly, with the intentions of affecting the entrepreneurship of the country, and intent that a private company imports experts and makes international transfers and do not nothing with the public sector of economy, which secures the vast majority of imports and exports, and so they are being forbidden to chain productive cooperations, which are typical of small companies in the whole planet. But on the top, the fact that they haven't modified any sanction, it is there's no compliance of those actions that within the Cuban law we have decided to accept, despite the aggressive and hostile purposes. Of course, the Cuban difficulties of the difficulties of Cuban society is not due only to the US blockade, as I said, but I reaffirmed, and I think I have demonstrated, that the fundamental cause of the difficulty of Cuban difficulties and of the Cuban people and economy is the blockade. Our people and our government are working together to diffuse the hurdles caused by the US blockade, to make more efficient the management of government, and in all levels to make more efficient the economic management, and so the resistance, the participation, the creative participation of the people, and the decision of the vast majorities of Cubans of defending the independence, the national independence, sovereignty, the homeland, and the socialism played a crucial role in Cuba. That determination of our people includes fighting of inequalities, social inequalities, to diminish them. It includes to combat for the legitimate increase of salaries, for preventing distortions, for preventing irregularities in our economy, and the participation of the people is crucial too. And so the people are fighting against the corruption and high prices, and the popular supportive participation in the actions for stabilizing economy, for boosting our economy, and developing social policies for the solution of difficulties present today in the health, education sectors, and for protecting families with low income, with low incomes. So I really appreciate the support to Cuba and the support of Cubans residents in other countries. 49 governments, 101 political parties, 66 parliaments, 426 solidarity movements and associations of Cubans overseas, 25 international organizations, former presidents, congresspersons of the United States, journalists and intellectuals have demanded in these months the exclusion of Cuba from the states sponsoring list country, states sponsoring terrorism list. And so they asked the removal of that list. So our government is working and will be working without rest, united with our people, to stabilize and recover the economy despite the destructive and smothering impact of the U.S. blockade, knowing that it is a huge challenge, byproduct of the cruel, bilateral, aggressive U.S. policy, but knowing that we have to overcome the U.S. blockade with our own efforts by ourselves. We have done it before and we will be able to do it, and we can do it now, and we have to lift the blockade. We have to do it by ourselves. Thank you very much.
We were just listening to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. We were just listening to Bruno Rodríguez Parrilla, Cuban Foreign Minister, as he gave a detailed account on the impact of the U.S. embargo, the U.S. blockade on Cuba and its effects on the economy and ultimately on the life of all Cubans on the island. Also, he detailed the economic impacts that the blockade has on a daily routine, also on the Cuban economy. Specifically, he detailed the impacts on the healthcare system, also on the provision of. Let's continue listening to the press conference.
The report of this resolution by the UN at this moment. First, dozens of governments will be rejecting the U.S. blockade at the United Nations General Assembly, and with all certainty there will be an unanimous a joint vote, and it will be demonstrated that this policy, besides the damages caused by our people, it is the total isolation and the international condemnation to the United States, as it violates the humanitarian rights, the United Nations Charter, the Convention for the crime against genocide, and it will demonstrate that it's a lie, that it is a policy that do not intend to help the Cuban people. It will show again that the UN states members consider the U.S. blockade as an extraterritorial policy that harms its economy, its national interests, its companies and entrepreneurs. It will demonstrate again that causes the humanitarian damages. It will reiterate that the blockade affects U.S. citizens and other citizens, that it affects the Cuban families residing in the United States. It will launch a powerful message of a legal and judicial character, a powerful political message, a powerful moral message, ethical message, and it will be on due time, because a couple of days later there will be the U.S. elections in the United States, the U.S. elections, and there will be the welcoming of the international community to the new U.S. president. There will be a call to the current U.S. President Biden that uses its executive authorities to modify this U.S. policy inherited by the Republican government, which, however, he has applied very tightened, has tightened the blockade, and it will be an opportunity for the coming U.S. president to repair an injustice, to cease the humanitarian damages to the Cuban people, to gain credibility in its external policy, to avoid the tremendous damage that is suffering, and on the fight against terrorism and the organized crimes, which has been hurt by the politicization and the inclusion of Cuba to the states sponsoring terrorism list. And they will have, the next U.S. president will have the opportunity to develop relations, and Cuba has always expressed their will to have a dialogue based on mutual respect, sovereign equality, the non-intervention in the internal affairs as equals under the grounds of bilateral benefits with any government, any U.S. government or any U.S. president, as long as it is a serious and responsible dialogue, and we are just willing always to do so. I am sure that this new message of the United Nations General Assembly, to which and to most of all to the U.S. government, it is a new opportunity that they will be listened, and it will be the support will be endorsed. The present claim of the U.S. elections, of the majority of U.S. citizens and and Cuban residents, that the U.S. blockade against Cuba must be lifted, that Biden or any other president lift the blockade. Good morning, Minister Zamora from RT. Well, in the latest in the latest times, there's been an increase of imports of like food, automobiles, and this has been an excuse for some to believe that the blockade is a relative thing. But I would like to know your opinion about it, to enlarge on this theme. The blockade is complete, is absolute. The fact that there have some exceptions to the blockade, and that these exceptions have to be licenses to be able to export basic foods or medicines or medical equipment, demonstrate that the blockade is absolute, complete, oppressive, transversal, and the regulations confirmed so. In second place, those exceptions are discriminatory, as I already explained. They make vulnerable the international trade regulations about freedom of navigation, damage the interests of Cubans and of U.S. entrepreneurs and companies. They placed a small proportion in the international the trade of Cuba. The transactions with small companies of Cuba are very small, are very tiny. Nonetheless, they have some presence in the consumption of Cuban society, most of all of products completed, but they don't have an impact. But in third place, there is a lie that U.S. food imports are increasing. The U.S. government is usually lying, and I am sure that on October 30, they will continue lying when they provide the datum of U.S. exports to Cuba. And actually, they provide the datum of the license they provided, but they were not executed by the oppressive measures of the blockade. They just provide a large datum, but a liar, very lying. And donations are very small, but they have a remarkable value for the spirit of our people, for its solidarity character, that the civilians, the U.S. organizations conduct against the U.S. policy, against the harassment of the U.S. government, of other agencies, of OFA, as they threatened with sanctions due to these donations, these humanitarian donations towards Cuba. These purchases can grow due to we are very near because of the structure of prices, and as the ships are cheaper because of there's just a couple of kilometers, but they could grow if the United States flexibilized some other aspects of blockade, or if they do not deny a agricultural trader or any other person the possibility of having a bidirectional commerce, and if the U.S. government does not deny the possibility of importing vaccines, pharmaceutical products, and most of them, which are the only ones and the most efficient on the planet, or if they do not, or if the U.S. authorities do not deny to enjoy the U.S. citizens of products like like the Cuban cigars or any other products, or if they do not damage the imports towards third country parties. Once there was high the level of purchase to the United States, but it was significant. But today it is not. That's the truth. Even though there are some sectors in which some foods are gotten from them, but the blockade is absolutely oppressive, transversal, and the sections through these licenses, these unique licenses for certain products, confirmed the regulation, the blockade. And I come back to the lungs ventilators which were prevented due to blockade, due to the US blockade. Well, I recognize the agency AF. Good morning, Minister. I would like to ask you, what are your expectations after the U.S. elections regarding the blockade? Do you think that Kamala Harris would be better for lifting the blockade, or another, or if Donald Trump wins? Well, it is a hypothetical question. If you could tell me who's gonna win, or who has already won the U.S. elections, I could answer. But what can I tell you is that the lifting of the U.S. blockade must be unilateral, unconditional, complete, and immediate, for the reasons that it is illegal, violating the international rights. It prevents freedoms of the U.S. Citizens. It is anti-democratic, as it disregards the will of the U.S. citizens and Cuban residents in the United States, as in some social media they promise to do so to voters, for the fact that Cuba has always willing to help talks seriously, irresponsibly, under the basis of sovereignty, with any government, any Republican or Democrat government of the United States, for our similar willing to any government emerging from these elections, for the fact that the only honest, responsible, serious of President of the White House would be to modify some sanctions of the U.S. policy in which the president has been applying strictly during his term. But I reiterate that it is a hypothetical question. I could answer you after the results of the U.S. elections. Well, I am going to collect a last question. Any other question? Thank you very much. I really appreciate your attendance.
We were listening to Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno report on the effects of the Cuban embargo, the Cuban blockade, the blockade that the U.S. has imposed on Cuba. And in that way, he gave a detailed account on the effects that the blockade happens on the island and on the country, also on the country's economy and the lives of the people of the country. Among the most important details that he gave were numbers regarding the effects of the blockade. For example, he stated that 25 days without the blockade would account for all the needs of medicine for the people. Also, he said that 4 months without the blockade proposed by the U.S. would account for all the needs regarding the food basket that could be guaranteed to all the citizens of Cuba. In this way, the Foreign Minister Bruno Rodríguez Parrilla also detailed the way in which this type of measures continue to be applied, and he made reference to the presence of Cuba on the list of countries sponsoring terrorism and the way that this is incongruent with other measures that the U.S. has said. And also he made reference to U.S. authorities also mentioning and acknowledging that Cuba fully cooperates in the fight against terrorism, but however continues to be on that list that hinders day-to-day daily life of Cubans. So in this way, after a press conference regarding the matter, Cuba once again continues to thanked the support in its fight and its constant call for the U.S. blockade to be brought down so that the people of Cuba can continue to work for the development of their country. We will have more information on upcoming news briefs. Stay tuned with teleSUR English.